The hum of machinery filled the laboratory, like a swarm of bees trapped in a bell jar. It was a sound Adrian Kepler had come to know well, an intimate symphony of precision and power. But today, it was different. Today, the air crackled with something more, something that had never been there before, the promise of greatness, or disaster. Adrian stood at the center of the room, adjusting the dials on the control panel with a steady hand, his heart beating a little faster than usual. He had spent years of his life building this experiment, chasing a single, almost impossible dream, to harness the power of black holes, not as destructive forces, but as tools, manipulable in ways that defied the very laws of physics. His colleagues had laughed at him when he first suggested the idea, calling him reckless, delusional even. But today, Adrian was about to prove them all wrong. Behind him, his assistant Phil, his intern, watched nervously. The kid was only a year out of college, and the wide-eyed awe he had once shown for Adrian's work had been replaced with quiet apprehension. Today wasn't just any experiment. Today was the culmination of everything Adrian had worked for. A chance to step beyond the boundary of human understanding. "You're sure this is safe?" Phil asked, a hint of doubt creeping into his voice. His fingers fidgeted with the edge of his notepad. Adrian didn't look back. His gaze was fixed on the flickering screens in front of him, the swirling images of theoretical equations and black hole simulations. "Safety is subjective," he said, almost to himself. "I mean, you can't expect progress without a little risk, can you?" Phil gulped. "Yeah, well, you are talking about creating a mini black hole. In here. On purpose." Adrian turned his head slightly, a smirk curling at the corners of his lips. "It's fine, Phil. What could go wrong?" He didn't bother to explain the complexity of what he was about to do. Phil wouldn't understand, and Adrian didn't have time for explanations. The world would understand soon enough. The room grew darker as the main device activated, a massive, complicated machine that resembled a tangle of wires and spheres, a mechanical spider built to pull apart the very fabric of reality. Adrian hit a final switch, and the machine whirred to life. The air around them seemed to vibrate, the atoms buzzing like 1,000 whispers in an ancient tongue, and then, there was a bright flash of light. A flash that tore through Adrian's retinas, sending a jolt through his body. It wasn't the explosion he expected. It wasn't a violent rupture of the space-time continuum. No, this was something more subtle. Something that slipped beneath his skin. For a moment, everything went silent. Phil stood frozen, his mouth open, eyes wide with shock. Adrian reached for his glasses, feeling a dull pain at the back of his head as he adjusted them. His fingers trembled, his skin feeling suddenly too tight, as though something inside him was pushing against the boundaries of his body. Dr. Kepler?" Phil's voice was small, uncertain. You okay?" Adrian blinked. The room was still dark, but he could see clearly now, more clearly than ever. His eyes darted to the monitor. The black hole simulation that had been running on screen was now frozen, suspended in time, hovering like a dark god above a blue-lit altar. "I'm fine, Phil," Adrian said, though there was an odd weight to his voice. He tried to steady himself, but his legs felt unsteady, like they were floating just a few inches above the floor. He looked down, half expecting to see the ground beneath him. Instead, he saw the walls of the lab bending inward. No, not the walls themselves, but the space between him and the walls, warping, twisting as though the very air around him had turned elastic. The sensation of weightlessness surged again. His mind reeled. What's happening to me?" Adrian muttered, almost too softly for Phil to hear. His heart pounded in his chest as he reached out instinctively, touching the wall beside him. But instead of feeling the cold metal surface of the lab, his fingers sank through it. Okay, that wasn't supposed to happen," Adrian said, his voice a little too loud, a little too frantic. His hand pulled back quickly. The space in front of him seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. His gaze flicked to Phil, who stood frozen in the doorway, staring at him with wide eyes. Did you see that?" Adrian asked, his voice shaking now. Phil nodded, his mouth agape. "Yeah, I saw it." Your hand just went through the wall." Adrian stared down at his fingers. They were trembling. He could feel the power, the force, pulsing beneath his skin. His breath caught in his throat as he realized something even more terrifying. The particles, the black hole particles, hadn't just interacted with his experiment. They had entered his body. It was a rush, a high, a feeling unlike anything he had ever experienced. He could bend space. He could twist time. He could erase things from existence itself. For a brief moment, all of it seemed beautiful, like some kind of cosmic art, a dance between creation and destruction. His first instinct was to test it. The phone on the desk. He focused on it, and in an instant, it disappeared, vanishing into nothingness. Not broken, not thrown, but completely erased from reality. "Dr. Kepler." Phil's voice snapped him out of his trance. "What did you do to the phone?" "It's gone. Like it never existed." Adrian looked at Phil, a grin slowly spreading across his face. "I just made it disappear," he said, his voice carrying an eerie calm. "Do you see it now, Phil? Do you see what we can do?" Phil swallowed hard, taking a step back. "I think we need to stop the experiment." Before Phil could finish, Adrian flicked his wrist. The intern's words dissolved into the air, as though they had been swallowed by some unseen force. Adrian turned, marveling at the sensation. He had done it. He had unlocked the ability to control reality itself. But then, something changed. The air seemed to thicken around him, pressing against his skin, pulling at the edges of his mind. The high that had come with his discovery began to fade, replaced by a creeping dread. Something was wrong. The particles, the black hole particles, had not only given him power, they had begun to consume him. Adrian's heart raced as he staggered toward the control panel. The first sign of something slipping out of his grasp, the walls of the lab were still bending and warping. Time itself was starting to lose its grip. He could feel it, like the world was dissolving into a soup of possibilities. The clock on the wall stopped ticking. Not just slowed down. It stopped. Adrian's breath hitched. He glanced at the mirror above the sink. His reflection was distorted, his features twisting unnaturally, as if caught in a vortex. The black hole energy inside him was hungry, thirsty for more. And it was beginning to feed. "I need to stop this," Adrian whispered to himself. "Before it's too late." Adrian staggered back from the mirror, his pulse pounding in his ears as his reflection twisted in a way that felt both alien and terrifying. The black hole particles inside him were no longer a mere curiosity, they were consuming him. Slowly, he began to realize that the power he'd gained wasn't just a gift, it was a virus, one that would devour not only him but everything in its wake. The room pulsed, the walls stretching and contracting like the slow rhythm of a heartbeat, and Adrian stumbled to the center of the lab, trying to steady himself. He was dimly aware of Phil in the corner, his wide eyes flicking from the warped mirror to Adrian, his mouth working soundlessly as though trying to speak but finding no words. "Phil, stay back," Adrian snapped, though his voice barely rose above a rasp. He didn't know if it was the particles, or his own fear, but the words felt disconnected from his body. Like he was speaking from a place far, far away. Phil took another step backward, looking at the walls with a mix of terror and fascination. What happened to you?" The question was like a mantra in the room, slow, deliberate, and damning. Adrian didn't answer. His hands were shaking, and he couldn't stop them. Every part of him felt too big for his own skin, like the universe itself was pressing against him. He closed his eyes, willing himself to focus, to regain control. He reached out, almost instinctively, to to steady himself against the desk, but it felt wrong. The desk was alive, in some bizarre, unfamiliar way. It wasn't simply wood and metal anymore, it was pulsing, shifting, bending like soft clay in the palm of an unseen giant. His breath quickened. The air itself was too thick now, too oppressive. And then, in a blink, he saw the truth. The black hole particles, which had originally just been a tiny, theoretical experiment, had latched onto him like a parasite. And now, they were spreading, spilling into the very space around him, warping everything. Reality itself was crumbling at the edges, and Adrian could feel himself slipping further into it. His body was no longer his own, it was an engine of destruction, and it was firing on all cylinders. That he glanced at the screen again. The simulation, the one that had originally shown a stable, controlled black hole, was now nothing more than a swirling chaos of unstable energy. The image flickered and vibrated. Adrian felt a pull deep inside, an urge to reach through the screen, to touch that swirling mass of energy, to take control. But he resisted. He had to. Adrian, Phil's voice was faint, trembling. You've got to fix this. We need to. Shut up. Adrian snapped, his voice unexpectedly sharp. I don't know how to fix this. I didn't plan for this. The words came out in a ragged breath, like he was speaking through sandpaper. His thoughts were slipping away, unraveling faster than he could stitch them together. He needed to think. To concentrate. With a violent shove, Adrian pushed away from the desk, but instead of the solid resistance of the desk, his body shot forward like it had been thrust by an invisible force, tumbling toward the wall. He barely had time to react before he slammed into it, though, instead of feeling the expected sting of impact, he felt a strange, liquid sensation. He was no longer touching the wall, he was passing through it. The physical world bent around him like soft clay. Phil screamed, but Adrian couldn't hear him anymore. His senses were overwhelmed by the rising hum in his chest, the unbearable pressure from the particles now swirling inside him. The black hole particles had fused with his own molecules, entwining themselves in ways no human brain could comprehend. The pull within him was more than just gravitational, it was insatiable, an empty hunger that could never be satisfied. Adrian stumbled back, his hand reaching for the air, but instead of stopping at the surface of the wall, his fingers sank deeper, as though the very fabric of space was thinning beneath his touch. The walls were dissolving. No, it wasn't the walls. It was him. He was disappearing. His own body was becoming part of the void. God, no. Adrian gasped, his voice catching as panic rose in his throat. No, no, no. The words didn't seem to make sense. They hung in the air like whispers, vanishing before they could leave his mouth. With a Herculean effort, Adrian forced himself back into the present moment. He focused, tried to focus, on something, anything, that could anchor him. His mind clung to the image of the control panel. Stop this. He needed to stop this before it consumed everything. But the black hole inside him was insistent. It wanted more. It wanted to feed. In desperation, Adrian reached for the nearest object, a chair that had been knocked over in the chaos, and willed it to vanish. But as he did, something strange happened. The chair didn't simply disappear into nothingness. It was pulled into him, sucked inside, as though his very body had become a vacuum, devouring the matter around him. No! Adrian gasped, trying to pull the chair back. But it was gone, swallowed whole by the force inside him, leaving only a sickening emptiness behind. Adrian, please, Phil pleaded from across the room, his voice trembling with fear. You have to stop this. You're killing everything. Adrian turned to him, the words of panic and regret bubbling up in his throat. He opened his mouth to speak, to beg for help, but when he tried, nothing came out. The space between them began to stretch, as if they were both caught in a slow-motion distortion. Time itself was bending again. He felt it. saw it. He could hear the space-time continuum bending and groaning, the edges of the world warping into a spiral of impossible angles, and then, there was a loud crack, followed by a sudden, bone-rattling silence. Adrian's hand shot to his head as the world around him spun wildly, the ground beneath his feet beginning to sway as if it were water. He couldn't stay focused anymore. His vision blurred, and he staggered forward, almost falling over the desk before finally collapsing to his knees. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. I need to fix this. The thought echoed through his head, a desperate cry for sanity. But how? How could he possibly fix something so fundamentally broken? How could he fight something that was inside him, rewriting the rules of existence with every breath he took? The lab around him seemed to be collapsing. The edges of his vision began to fold in on themselves, the floor itself warping and stretching like taffy. He reached out to steady himself, but his hand sank into the air as though the universe itself had become liquid. And then, with a sickening lurch, the last vestiges of the lab, the walls, the floor, the desk, Phil's terrified face, all disappeared. There was nothing. Only darkness. Only the overwhelming pull of the void. Adrian felt the last traces of the lab dissolve into nothingness, the pull of the black hole particles inside him dragging everything into a singularity of chaos. His body was no longer solid, his thoughts disjointed as the very fabric of reality seemed to bend and collapse. Time stretched, then contracted. The world around him flickered like a broken TV signal, jumping for moments, disjointed, unhinged. He tried to scream, but no sound came. Not that it would have mattered. There was nothing left to scream at. The space that had once held his laboratory, his sense of control, was gone. The air around him was as dark as the deepest part of space, a void that sucked in the last traces of his humanity. For a long moment, he couldn't feel his body. It was as if he had lost all sensation, as if he were floating inside the very fabric of the universe. He was inside the black hole. No, worse. He had become the black hole. And he was nothing but a whisper, a flicker of existence in the vast, suffocating void. Then, like a sudden crash of thunder after a long silence, Adrian was yanked back into himself. He gasped. The cold, sharp reality of his own skin hit him like a slap. He was, somewhere. But where? The world around him was no longer a familiar space, no longer the controlled lab he had once known. No. He was standing in the middle of a vast, empty wasteland. The ground beneath his feet was cracked, like dried mud, with deep fissures running through it. The air was thick with a strange, oppressive weight, the kind of atmosphere one would expect to feel on a distant, dying planet. And yet, it was familiar. It felt like something he had once seen in a dream, a place where the laws of physics no longer mattered. He stumbled forward, his legs shaking beneath him, feeling the intense, almost unbearable pull of the void growing stronger with each step. The ground beneath him trembled as if reacting to his every movement. His breath came in sharp, desperate gasps, his heart pounding painfully in his chest as though trying to break free from its confines. The pull inside him, the hunger of the black hole particles, was relentless. Please. Adrian whispered to himself, though he wasn't sure if he was begging for mercy or for clarity. Please, let me out. Let me fix this. But his words seemed to be swallowed by the thick, unyielding silence of the place. There was no echo, no sound of any kind. Only the weight of the silence pressed against him like a physical force. He closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing, trying to think. He had to do something. The lab was gone, yes, but the particles were still inside him. He could feel them, writhing, consuming his insides, bending space and time around him, pulling everything toward an inevitable collapse. The more he tried to suppress them, the more they seemed to grow, expanding within him, devouring the very world around him. He reached out, instinctively, to control it, to push back against the overwhelming force. His hand shot through the air, and in that moment, he felt the space stretch under his fingers. The air around him shimmered, like the surface of a pool disturbed by a single drop. But the sensation was fleeting, disappearing almost as quickly as it had come. God, Adrian breathed, his voice barely audible. What have I done? There was a sudden movement at the corner of his vision. He turned sharply, his heart thudding in his chest as he saw someone, emerging from the darkness. It was Phil. The intern. He was standing there, in the distance, eyes wide and filled with terror. Phil? Adrian called out, his voice desperate. But the words felt strange, foreign to him, as though the very concept of speech was becoming alien. Phil's face was twisted with fear, but it wasn't fear of Adrian, not exactly. It was something deeper, something more primal. He didn't say anything at first, just stared. Adrian could see the shadows of confusion and horror shifting across his face. Dr. Kepler? Phil finally spoke, his voice trembling as he took a step forward. Where are we? What is this place? Adrian's throat tightened, and for a moment, he could hardly breathe. He had no answer. The world around him, the strange, desolate landscape, seemed to swallow up the words he wanted to say. His thoughts were disjointed, and even the sound of his own voice seemed strange, distant, as if it were coming from a place far removed from reality. I don't know, Adrian managed to say. He shook his head, his mind racing. I don't know what happened. I was trying to control it. But I can't. I can't control it. Phil's eyes flicked to the ground, then to the sky above. But the sky was just as dark, endless, and empty as the ground beneath their feet. There was nothing. No stars, no clouds, no sun, just a void stretching forever in all directions. Adrian's hands clenched into fists at his sides, the black hole particles inside him pulling at everything, at Phil, at the space around them, at the very core of his being. He could feel it. The hunger. The overwhelming, insatiable hunger to consume. It was a part of him now, an extension of his will, and yet it felt more like an alien force, an uncontrollable, destructive presence that was beginning to devour everything it touched. I have to fix this, Adrian said, more to himself than to Phil. His eyes were wide with a wild, almost frantic intensity. He could feel the pull inside him growing stronger, the energy of the black hole building up, threatening to break free of him completely. Adrian, Phil said softly, his voice a tremor in the empty wasteland. What do you mean, fix this? It's happening, isn't it? We're already gone. Adrian turned sharply to look at him. His breath hitched in his chest. No, he whispered. No, we're not gone. I can stop this. I can fix it. But even as he said the words, he wasn't sure. He didn't know how to stop it. He didn't know how to reverse what had happened. The black hole particles inside him were beyond his control. They were no longer just a tool. They were a force of nature. And now, the longer he tried to fight them, the more they consumed him. Adrian took a deep breath, reaching for the fragment of rationality still buried beneath the panic. There had to be a way. He had to think. He had to find a way to reset this, revert back to the moment before he inhaled the particles, before he made the mistake of allowing them inside. But the longer he stayed in this place, the more the void stretched. And the more it stretched, the more he felt himself vanishing. The black hole particles were eating at his very existence, pulling him further from the world he had once known. I can't let this happen, Adrian whispered, more to himself than to Phil. He felt a sudden, intense urge to do something, anything, to stop the collapse. To reset the moment when everything went wrong. Adrian closed his eyes and focused with every ounce of his will. His body, though still faintly tethered to the physical world, felt thin. He reached into the darkness around him, trying to grasp at the very fabric of reality, trying to bend time and space. And for a fleeting second, he thought he might have done it. The world around him flickered. The horizon wavered. The particles inside him throbbed, as if responding to his desperate plea for control, but then, with a loud, gut-wrenching crack, the void snapped back. The ground shook, the air rushed in all directions, and everything around him, Phil, the wasteland, the very concept of space itself, collapsed inward, pulled into the black hole that had become Adrian's very essence. There was a moment of stillness. Of nothingness, then, everything stopped.